All right. Thanks everybody for coming. I think we'll get started. Um, Thanks to everybody for showing up at today's Wednesday seminar. It's my great pleasure to introduce a good friend and colleague, Dr. Qindan Zhu. She is the PI of the Air Pollution and Climate Lab at the Harvard and Smithsonian Astrophysics Observatory. She got her PhD from UC Berkeley in Earth and Planetary Science and was a postdoc then at MIT as the NOAA uh, Climate and Global Climate and Global Change Fellow, and then as the Houghton Fellow at MIT. So Qindan and I know we know each other for a very long time. We went to the same college in Beijing. So yesterday at dinner, we are just talking about, it feels like 10 years ago, we were sitting in the classroom taking the same class, but now we are both faculty members. So it's kind of surreal to think about it. And over the years, I've followed Qindan's work. I think one thing I really admire about her work is really I think, was trained as a modeler, but her research really cross the discipline that she's now really expert in leveraging a lot of the satellite information into the modeling world, but also leveraging a lot of the field observations. And some of the research is really interesting, and I'm sure we'll hear more about her group's work on exploring the climate and air pollution interactions. All right, please join me to welcome.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Niño, for the invitation as well as the great introduction. And it's my great honor to come to Stony Brook University today to give a seminar. So I would like to begin my talk by showing this time-lapse video. It's taken over the city of the Beijing, and as the sun rises, the photochemistry is just triggered in this area, and you see these air pollution pools just build up in a very short time, and they occupy the whole view of this camera. And this is not because there's a very large local sources nearby, or it's also not a very unique event. In fact, the dramatic occurrence of atmospheric chemistry occurs every day and everywhere. And the key player that controls the pace of this atmospheric chemistry is a chemical species named hydroxyl radical, or OH. So the recognition of the important role of OH was a major step forward in our understanding of the atmospheric chemistry. These are the words from Paul Crutzen during his Nobel lecture. And Paul Crutzen, along with Maria Molina and Sherwood Rowland, was awarded the Nobel Prize for their outstanding outbreak researches in atmospheric chemistry, especially the discovery of the ozone hole here. And that's also the first time that the OH was discovered as a catalyst of the ozone depletion in the stratosphere. But later, like 6 years later, not that 6 years later, Harry Levy just published another paper in Science, and that was the first publication that highlights the role of the OH in the tropospheric chemistry as well. So OH is considered as the centerpiece of the atmospheric chemistry, and in these slides, I want to present one of the hot debates in our field that's centered around the OH, which is the methane trends. So methane is a very important greenhouse gases that's second only to carbon dioxide, and they contribute to almost one watt per cubic meter. While CO trends tend to increase steadily over the past years, methane presents these very interesting nonlinear trends. It increased steadily until about 2000 and reached to this plateau between 2000 and 2007. And after 2007, it increased again. In the recent years, during COVID and upwards, we even see these enormously high methane trends. So there have been a lot of study, and it's really the forefront of the researchers and trying to interpret what causes the nonlinear methane trends. And they have to go back to this methane budget. So if we look at the methane sources, nearly 50% of the methanes are coming from the human activities such as industrial and biomass, industrial burning, agricultures, and the biomass burnings. And that's actually the emission that the current policies is focused on to mitigate the methane increase. For example, there's the Global Methane Pledge that's already counted nearly 160 countries, and their goal is trying to cut 30% of the methane emissions by 2030 through regulation of these anthropogenic methane emissions. But it's not the complete story yet, because there's another 50% of the methane are emitted from the natural sources, such as the wetland or other natural emissions. And indeed, they're having studies suggesting that the recent methane gross anomalies is actually attributed to the wetland emissions of some microbial activities. So if that's true, that means that our regulations on the anthropogenic methane emissions is actually not that effective, because the methane growth is controlled by the natural sources. So there's indeed a whole debate here, but in order to answer this question, we also need to constrain the methane sinks. So compared to the methane sources that has a variety of the different emission sources, the methane sinks is pretty much dominated by the reaction with OH. And the OH reactions contribute to nearly 90% of the total methane loss. That said, we really need to constrain the methane sinks in order constrain the OH budget as well as the methane sinks in order to understand what indeed causes methane growth from in a different time period. And in this slide, I want to show you that the methane budget is actually very sensitive to the OH concentration. So the levels of the OH changes that we care about is actually on the order of 2 to 3% or 8% maximum. So in these slides, I'm showing a very simplified box modeling simulations that I assume that the methane emissions are stay fixed. And the upper panel is just the methane anomalies that we observed, and the lower panel is the OH anomalies that are enough to interpret these methane budgets shown in the upper panel. So if you care about the whole methane growth over the past 30 years, you will only need less than 8% of the OH changes. And if you care about the interannual variability of the methane budget, you only need 2 to 1% in some cases of the OH changes to interpret this methane budget. So we are looking at the very small perturbations of these chemical species in the atmosphere. But the OH measurements are very challenging and very sparse. So in this plot, I just lay out all the radicals, trace gases, air pollutants, as well as the greenhouse gases with its chemical lifetimes in the y-axis and the concentrations in the x-axis. And these give you a sense of how complicated systems that we are looking at in the tropospheric chemistry. And these chemical species will have the lifetime spans between 1 second to few decades, and the concentration was spanned by 8 orders of the magnitude. OH is located at the left corner of these panels, and it shows the lifetime about 1 second and the concentrations of about 1 part per trillion. That's why, because it's low concentration and short lifetime, making OH measurements and it's very hard. And the OH, if you look back to the history, the OH measurements are quite sparse, and it's quite local, so you can really not scale the OH observations to represent a larger spatial scales. So now we don't have a lot of OH measurements, so how can we estimate the OH? We normally estimate these OH indirectly using these tracer gases, and a lot of studies using a tracer named methylchlorophene. The methylchlorophene is a regulated chemical species because it's depleting the stratospheric ozone. That said, we have a very good long-term observations of the methylchlorophene and a relatively well-known methylchlorophene emissions. And since the dominant methylchlorophene loss is coming from the OH reactions, we can use this methylchlorophene information to infer the OH concentrations in the troposphere. But I have to say that this method embeds a very large uncertainties. So these different colors are just showing the estimated OH anomalies from different studies, but they are all using the methylchlorophene observations. But they have some different assumptions, such as the assumed interhemispheric ratios, the sampling bias, and etc. And it leads to a very big discrepancy in the OH estimates, especially between 2005 to 2014. And if you look at the specific years, if you look at the specific years like 2013, the discrepancy in the OH estimate could be as large as 10%. So this is way larger than the OH changes that we want to constrain to understand the methane budget. So in addition to these direct OH estimates, what else we know about the OH chemistry? So for the past 50 years, we have done a lot of studies centered around the OH chemistries. And here I just built this OH wheel. So I'm listing all the different parameters that have been reported in the earlier literature, showing that it has some co-association with the OH concentrations in the troposphere. And this is, of course, not an exhaustive list of these OH drivers, but it can at least give you a sense of like the complexity of the OH chemistries overall. So roughly, I categorize these drivers into two different types. The first type is named chemical drivers, such as NOx, CO, and VOCs, and they are regulated by these natural as well as anthropogenic emissions. But on the other hand, we have these meteorological drivers such as temperature, water vapor that are also reported have to affect the OH concentrations as well. So the best to best represent these OH chemistries, we normally run these chemistry climate models that has a very complex representations of OH chemistry in their chemical mechanisms in order to simulate the OH. So as a modeler, today I just want to show you three of my works aiming to advance the understanding of the OH chemistry from the chemistry climate modeling perspective. First of all, I would like to look back to the history, and I already showed you like the OH estimates indirectly from the mesocrophone, but in this project, I also want to see how the simulated OH change looks like, and if there's any discrepancy exists, what leads to this discrepancy. And then I will look into the current, and I will specifically looking at what drives the link between the OH and ENSO, the dominant climate variability modes that's in the current climate systems. And lastly, I will look into the future, and I want to understand how the OH will respond to the climate warming by building a new idealized chemistry climate models. Okay, so now guess right into the first project. So for the first project, I'm running this CAM-2 chemistry climate model configured with a VOC chemical mechanism. So it simulates both tropospheric chemistry as well as stratospheric chemistry. And this is the initial condition sample. So I have 30 members, and what I'm showing here is just one of the members. And it's a historical run running between 1950 to 2014. So it really takes a lot of computational power to get this model simulated. So I'm showing here is the OH column density, air mass weighted OH concentrations globally. And from these model simulations, you already see that the model was able to capture some of the spatial patterns of the OH. For example, OH tend to have some hotspots in the land such as Asia and North America. And in the regions such as Amazon forest, you are seeing a substantially lower OH concentrations compared to the surrounding regions. And there's also some latitudinal gradients of the OH as it's being higher in the tropical regions and lower in the higher latitudes. And also as the time goes by, you will also see that the spatial patterns of the OH have been changing across the time. So this is a global map, and next, I'm just integrated to the global averages. So the black line is showing the sample averages of the simulated OH trends, and the gray spaghetti line is just the OH anomalies from the individual model assembles, just to give you an idea of the impact from the internal climate variability. But if I overlay it with the OH estimates from these mesocrophone studies, we find that these models tend to give a very stable trends of the OH between 2005 to 2014. So it's ranging between minus 0.15% per year to 32% per year. So it's nowhere closer to any of the mesocrophone studies that presented before. So the next question is, which one we should trust more, and or in another way around, how can we evaluate these model OH trends? As I mentioned before, there's no not much of the always direct observations that's available. So in my projects, I decided to evaluate this model performance by comparing the OH chemical drivers. So if I bring back this OH wheel figure again, we know that the satellite actually give us some of the observational constraint on some of the chemical drivers. For example, the OMI satellite gives us the observations of the NO2 vertical current density and format high current density, which can serve as a proxy of NOx and the VOCs here. And in the another satellite named MOPIT that gave us the observations of the CO vertical current density between 2005 to 2014. So even though I cannot evaluate the model simulated OH, at least as a first step, I can evaluate how model is representing these OH chemical drivers. So this is the results of this comparison. What I'm showing here is the difference of the sample averages of the model simulations minus the satellite observations. From the left to the right is showing the NO2 vertical current density, format high vertical current density, and CO vertical current density. I won't spend too much time to go through this individual map and trying to address like why their difference is so different, why there's the discrepancy is so different, and for different chemical drivers, the sources of the bias, the source of the bias also seem to be different because if in this none of the model is perfect, and if you want to really get the perfect simulations, what you should do is to looking at the individual chemical drivers, identify the bias, the source of the bias, and then try to improve the model by correcting the source of the bias. But that's a lot of efforts. And as I mentioned before, this is a very computationally intensive model simulation. So it's always impossible for you to rerun the model and generate near perfect simulations of this chemical system. But in this project, I just want to bypass this tremendous modeling effort in trying to improve the model. But instead, I just want to focus on the OH chemistry, and I want to reframe my question like, if the model is constrained with the real world observations, how does the model OH will change? So to address this question, first of all, I trained a machine learning emulator to reproduce this OH simulated in the CAM-2 models. So I used the first 50% of the model simulations, the training data set, and I trained a fully connected neural network to reproduce these model simulated monthly OH columns. And in terms of the input features, I limited to 11 input features based on our best understanding of these OH chemistries. And a special note is for the 3 chemical drivers, all these chemical drivers actually can be observed from the satellite. Therefore, as the next step, in addition, instead of using the model chemical drivers, I will replace it with the real satellite observations and construct these new input features, put it into this model-based machine learning emulator to generate, to predict the observational constraint machine learning predictions for the monthly OH columns. And of course, there's a caveat that for other input features, and I'm still taking it from the model simulations. So this prediction is not necessary to fully represent the real world OH estimate, but by comparing these prediction to the purely model simulations, it gives you a sense of if the model is simulating these chemical drivers correct, how the OH will be changing. We conduct these prediction analysis at different spatial scales, but for the sake of time here, I'm only showing you the estimates of the predictions at the global level, just to kind of circle back to our original questions. So again, the black line is the direct model simulations, and the blue line is the observational constraint machine learning predictors. So compared to the model simulations, we find that our machine learning predictions doesn't seem to generate a prediction that very different from the model simulations, except that in between 2005 to 2014, it suggests a very slight reduction. However, if we overlay it with these indirect OH estimates from the methylchlorophone, we still don't think that it will close the gap between these indirect estimates as well as the model simulations. But this result itself is also very interesting because a few slides ago, I already showed you that the model have a very big bias in these chemical drivers. But indeed, when it's reflected to the OH changes, we don't see much of the OH changes. And we also look into the impact of the individual, the changes of the individual OH drivers. And we find that even though the model have the very big bias in these chemical drivers, the impact onto the OH chem sheet tend to cancel each other out. Therefore, it leads to a very buffered OH changes. And this kind of summarize my first project, but since these results still leave an open question that why there's still a very big discrepancy between these two of these OH estimates from these two approaches. In the next project, we decided to look into the model itself, and first just to look into a pattern that we observe from both the indirect OH estimates as well as from the model simulations. So if we can address something similar, then we can further address what caused the difference. So in the second project, I decided to dive into this ongoing questions about how OH is linked to ENSO. This project is also motivated by the previous studies. For example, there have been, for this methylchlorophene estimated OH chance, there have been studies showing that these interannual variations in the OH anomaly are related partly to the ENSO variability. But from the modeling perspective, there are also studies reporting the same thing. For example, there's a study based on the GFDL model that they have like thousands of years of the model simulations in absence of the external forcing, and they find that there's a very tight correlation between ENSO phases and the first principal components of the OH variability. So they conclude that the ENSO is a dominant mode of the OH variability. So it seems like the connection, the linkage between OH and ENSO has been recognized for a long time, but there's really no study answering why, like what is the underlying driving mechanism that link to this a relationship between OH and ENSO. And this is also the questions that my project want to understand. So here is the simplified OH chem sheet, and even though I say simplified, I understand that's already a lot of chem sheets going on that's represented here. But overall, we see that the red line is showing the OH production pathways and the blue line is the OH loss pathways. But I show this schematic here just to give you an idea of how the ENSO can possibly affecting the OH chem sheet. Well, under the different ENSO phases, we will of course have the different meteorological factors such as cloud cover, moistening, and atmospheric circulations. And all of these changes in the meteorology is likely to change these OH primary productions, but by affecting water vapor, solar radiation, as well as ozone here. But in the same time, the different ENSO phases will also lead to the changes in the lightning noise emission, the biomass burning emissions, as well as the biogenic emissions. So these emissions will further affect the different individual OH budget turns and then further affect the OH concentrations. So how could these different pathways under the regulation of the ENSO phases affecting OH? Are they competing with each other and amplifying or offsetting each other? This is that's the key focus of this project. So overall, first of all, we want to answer the question that how can we, whether or not we can detect these robust changes in the OH during El Niño and La Niña phases compared to the neutral conditions. And if we detect any robust changes, what are the roles of these different driving mechanisms? To answer these questions, we first go back to the 13-member initial condition CSM2 Wagon 6 model assembled to generate these composite SRT patterns. For the individual assembled members, I was able to calculate the SRT anomalies as well as the Niño 3-4-point index. And use that, I can further calculate them based on the Niño 3-4-point index ranges and then generate these composite SS patterns that best, to our understanding, best represent the SRT patterns under different ENSO phases. So this is just a movie showing these composite SRT patterns that the OH, the SRT is substantially higher over the tropical band during the El Nino patterns and vice versa during the La Nina ENSO phases. Once we have this composite SFT pattern generated, now we are running a new chemistry climate model named CAM-Chem model simulations. So CAM-Chem is very similar to the CESM 2106, except that it's not running any simulations in the stratosphere. So it's only focuses on the tropospheric chemistry. And it's driven by the prescribed SST patterns, and it has the modality-1 chemical mechanism embedded to simulate the chemistries along with the climate dynamics. So since I have this constant SST pattern generated, I can choose it as an input to the CAM-Chem model simulations to drive this model simulation and then give us the new give us the corresponding changes in the OH concentrations. And in terms of the emissions, we have the anthropogenic emissions fixed, but we have the interactive lighting NOx emission, biogenic emissions, as well as the composite biomass burning emissions. So in short, that means all these three different emissions are expected to change under the different meteorological patterns during these three different ENSO phases. So what I'm showing first is this OH anomaly relative to the neutral conditions. The left panel is the El Nino and the right panel is the La Nina. So overall, we find that during El Nino in the tropical mean OH, there is about 1.3% reduction of the tropical mean OH compared to the neutral conditions. However, during the La Nina conditions, even though we see some significant changes regionally, for example, in the maritime continents or in the east of the tropical Pacific, but if we average integrated to the tropical mean, there's no significant changes during the La Nina. This is kind of interesting because we expect these offset and symmetric pattern changes in the SST during La Nina and during El Nino and La Nina, but in fact, the changes in the OH is asymmetric. And we also dive deeper into what drives these changes in the OH. And since OH is very short-lived, it's controlled by the OH production rate divided by the OH loss frequency. So in the middle panel, I'm showing the anomaly of the OH production rate, also during El Nino and La Nina. And the lower panel, I'm showing the changes in the OH loss frequency. So overall, compared to the OH concentrations, we definitely observe a much consistent and higher changes in the OH budget tons. For example, in the OH production rate, we observe nearly 2% of the increase in the El Nino, but in the same time, during El Nino, El Nino also led to nearly 5% changes in the OH loss frequency. That's why the consistent increase in both OH production and losses cancels each other out and leading to about 1.3% reduction during El Nino. I'm not showing the La Nina result here, but the conclusion is quite similar that the La Nina. During the La Nina, we see the significant changes in the OH production rate and OH loss frequency, but they just intercount with each other and lead to the insignificant changes during the La Nina. So this is the overall OH budget with all the changes in both meteorology and these three different emission drivers. And next, I want to conduct a single forcing experiment and trying to diagnose the impact of the individual drivers onto this OH budget. So to design this experiment, I conduct all the model simulations in the CAM-Chem. And for each scenario, I run three different emission simulations driven by these three different SFT composite patterns. And for the first matte-only scenarios, I just turn off the interactive lighting NOx and the VOC emissions and keep all these different three emissions fixed, just as it is for the anthropogenic emissions. That said, if we're looking at this scenario alone, we will expect to see the impact onto the OH drivers that's only due to the changes in the meteorology during these three different ENSO phases. And next, I run the second scenario that I have not only the changes in the meteorology, but also these interactive lighting NOx emission schemes turned on. That said, by contrasting between the matte only and the matte plus LNO scenarios, we will see the impact of the changing lighting NOx emission during El Nino onto the OH chemistry. And similarly, I do the third experiment that focusing on the VOC emissions, and the last one focusing on the biomass burning emissions. And for each simulation, it runs for 7 years to assess the impact of the atmospheric variability here, because each year is driven by the same prescribed SRT patterns, but the year-to-year variation just reflects like the impact of the variability that's arising from the model only. This slide is just kind of the summary of all the results, summary of this impact of the different drivers. And if you are interested in the individual one, feel free to talk to me afterwards. So first, for the math only changes, what we are seeing here is if all the emissions are stay fixed during the ENSO phases and only the meteorology changes, during El Nino, we actually will see an increase in the OH concentrations instead of an OH reduction. And this is because the meteorology changes will lead to the increase in the solar radiation as well as water vapor, and that lead to the increase in the OH primary productions. However, for the lighting NOx emissions, I know that a lot of studies, existing studies suggest that the lighting NOx emission is a key driver leading to the connection between OH and ENSO phases. But in our study, we found the opposite conclusions, that the lighting NOx emission response is this linkage between OH and ENSO is unlikely to be caused by the lighting NOx emissions, because lighting NOx emission is overwhelmed by this unpredictable atmospheric variability. If you look into the lighting NOx emission in depth, the lighting NOx emission is actually much higher over the land than it is over the ocean. So even though we see the significant changes only over the tropical band, over the ocean in the lighting NOx emissions, the large variability that we observe over the land just overwhelms the signal from the ocean, leading to this insignificant response. However, for the biogenic emissions, we indeed see the opposite but significant changes. And with during the El Nino phases, because the temperature is warmer, we are seeing the increase in the VOC emissions, particularly in the Amazon forest. And this leads to the increase in the OH losses through the reaction with VOCs as well as CO, and it leads to the reduction of the OH. And the last piece is in the biogenic emissions. We see similar stories, but in different regions. And for the biogenic emission, about mass burning emissions, we find that the instantaneous response of the biogenic emissions actually only occur in the maritime continent. And this increase in the biomass burning emissions in this region also further increasing the OH losses and then lead to the reduction of the OH. So if we bring all the pieces together and put them into the same figure, the left panel is showing the changes in the OH through this combining tag, as well as these 4 different individual drivers. And the right panel is just showing the corresponding changes in the mass and chemical losses. And our first this is the result all during the El Nino. So our first takeaway is, if we look at the combined only, so probably the one that's closest to the real world conditions, we see a substantial reduction of the OH during the El Nino events. However, this is the result of the increase in the OH driven by the meteorology changes, offset by the decrease in the OH driven by the VOC emissions, as well as the biomass burning emissions. However, these results, you will see a very high error bus here, because this is just one model simulation that, while the representation of the emissions reflects our best understanding of these emission schemes. However, it's really substantial, subject to very large atmospheric variability. So I would easily expect that when we have some new emission schemes built up for these different emission drivers, the resulting OH changes will be different. Okay, so this is my second project, and next project I want to switch the gears to a little bit to the future, and specifically looking at how OH will respond to the climate warming. This project is motivated by this climate feedback of methane, because we know that methane as greenhouse gases will lead to the climate warming, but the climate itself will also feed back onto the methane budget. If we bring back the budget again, there are two budgets that are specifically sensitive to the temperature. The first one is these massive natural emissions, and the second one is the OH concentrations. My project just want to look at the OH chemistry responses, but if we look at the individual drivers, we find that there are two categories that lead to the OH connection to the climate warming. The first one I call it direct response, so mainly through this meteorology. And the second one is I call it indirect response through these biogenic volatile organic compounds emissions. And for the anthropogenic emissions, we might expect some of the temperature dependence, but we omit it here because we think it's not as large as either the natural emissions as well as the climate, the meteorology changes. So for this project, we of course can do the same approach, same method as we did in the second project. That means we have these couple chemistry climate models such as CAM-Chem and run this single forcing experiment and then to diagnose the individual drivers. However, in this project, we don't really want to do that because these models are very computation expensive. And if we are running these single forcing experiment, that means these model simulations are just used specifically for a specific goal of this project. But instead, we want to build a new model framework that can be applied to a more broader side questions, like specifically looking at the interaction between atmospheric chemistry and climate. And this idea is coming from this paradigm. So here, I just look into the current modeling community, and I place these models with the chemistry complex in the y-axis and dynamic complexity in the x-axis. And I found that the current model scheme only has three paradigms that's covered. We have this fully coupled chemistry climate model such as CAM-Chem that we have a very complex, very high complexity in both the chemistry and dynamics. And that also means that it takes the most computational resources to run. But that's actually required if we want to look at the interaction between chemistry and climate. At the same time, we have these atmospheric general circulation models such as CAM-6. It has the same complexity of the dynamics, but it has no chemistry. So it will be a very good modeling framework to study, for example, climate dynamics, but it's, you cannot use it to study the interaction with chemistry. And in the climate model community, they also build up this like idealized model. And here I'm using aquaplanet configuration as one example. And they build this as a hierarchy in the climate model, and specifically because they want to take a benefit of shorter integration time in this model. And also it has a much lower degree of gradient. So this idealized model framework can help to understand the complex phenomenon that you observe in these general circulation models. And the idea of hierarchying the climate models is really widely applied in the climate modeling community, but not yet in the chemistry climate model community. Therefore, in this project, I specifically want to build a new idealized chemistry climate model that will fulfill the last quadrant of this diagram. And I name it as Aquaplanet. It has a very low computation cost, but it will have the same detailed chemistry representations as the CAM-Chem model simulations. And this is just some configurations. This Aqua-chem will have no land, it's mainly water covered. It will have a much simplified dynamics by prescribing these zonal average, annual mean, SFC patterns, but it still retains some of the general circulation features such as Hartley cell as well as the upper tropospheric jet. We also have some simplifications in the emissions that by assuming there's no monthly variation. So with these configurations, we were able to bring down the computation cost of the Aqua-chem by 10 times lower than the fully coupled chemistry climate models such as CAM-Chem. That means if we want to look at the same changes in the OH chemistries, while the CAM-Chem need to run about 30 years, the Aqua-chem only need to run 4 years and much to generate the same sample sizes. So it really helps in terms of reducing the computation cost, but Also, we think this idealized Aqua-chem model has a much broader applications. While my project specifically looking at the OA chemistry, this model framework can be built up to look at other aspects of the chemistry-climate interaction, such as aerosol cloud interaction or the aerosol invigoration, etc. And whenever we have a new model framework built up, the first immediate question is always like how good it is and whether we should trust this model results or not. So since this project only specifically looking at the OH chemistry, so I'm showing the evaluation results against this CAM-Chem model to convince you that this Aqua-chem reproduce the contributions of these individual OH production and loss pathways simulated in the CAM-Chem. So the left panel is the OH production rate and the right panel is the OH loss frequency, and different color badges are showing the different OH pathways, and you will know that even though it's not like one-to-one mapping, but Aqua-chem overall generates do a very good job in reproducing this relative contribution as well as rankings of these individual OA production and loss pathways. So it gives us some faith that even though this Aqua-chem is very easy to run and we can run it like in a very short time, it reproduce some of the important characteristics of the OA chemistries that of our focus of this project. So now we prove that Aqua-chem is useful in analyzing the OH chemistry. So next, I'm designing these single forcing experiments in the Aqua-chem setting instead of CAM-Chem setting to characterize the OH response to the idealized warming. So first, I run two simulations with all the emissions stay constant, but increase the SLT patterns by 2 kelvins to represent these idealized warming scenarios. And I conduct the third simulations here that I not only increase the SLT pattern by 2 Kelvin, but also increase the biogenic emission by about 40% in the idealized warming cases. And this number is coming from the CAM-Chem model simulations that's driven by the Megan biogenic schemes. And when we increase the temperature by 2 Kelvin globally, we find that this biogenic emissions will increase by about 40%, and we put the same number onto these idealized warming scenarios. So by comparing these first two cases, we will assess the impact of the OH response to the warming through the changes in the meteorology. And by comparing the second and third model simulations, we were able to assess the impact of the VOC emissions. So here comes the results. What I'm showing first is just the changes in the OH production rate and the OH changes in the OH loss frequency. The first panel is showing all the combined changes, so the OH response both to the climate warming with the changes in both meteorology and VOC emissions. And similar to ENSO, we find that the climate warming will increase both the OH production rate as well as OH loss frequency. But if we diagnose the individual drivers, we find that the meteorology will have the larger changes in the OH production rate specifically, while the VOC emissions will have the largest impact in the OH loss frequency. And for the math-only changes, if we get down to the individual OH production rates, we find that nearly 90% of the increase in the OH production rate is coming from this OH primary production, namely the photolysis of ozone followed by the reaction with water vapor. And this is not surprising because the climate warming, the 2 Kelvin temperature warming will lead to about 15% changes in the water vapor, and this is a direct reactant in these OH production pathways. However, if we look at the VOC emissions, the story is a little bit different. And for the VOC, we find that about 40% of the increase in the OH loss frequency is coming from the reaction between OH and these directly freshly emitted VOC species like isoprene and monoterpene. And this is also clustered in the regions with abundant VOC emissions such as maritime continent and the Amazon forest. However, we also find that these alternative VOC reactions as well as COs will contribute another 40% of the increase in the OH loss frequency. And that implies that while we have these freshly emitted VOC species, once it reacts with OH, it will generate these secondary products, including oxygenated VOCs as well as COs. And for CO specifically, it's longer lived, so it will able to transport further away from the source regions and leading to a larger OH losses, not only in the source regions, but also in the broader charcoal regions. So now if we put together these results again, similarly, the left panel is showing the relative changes in the OH, and the right panel is showing the relative changes in the methane chemical losses. For the 2 Kelvin climate warming, we find that we should expect to about 3% increase in the OH concentrations, and that corresponds to about 6% increase in the methane chemical loss. And this is a result of the larger increase in the OH due to meteorology changes, offset by about 6% reduction in the OH due to the BVOC emissions. But similar to the second result project, in addition to take these numbers as a major takeaway, we also want to emphasize that this response of the BVOC emissions is highly uncertain, and it really depends on how you categorize this response of these BVOC emissions in these climate systems. Okay, so I want to wrap up my talk by showing this figure here. So throughout my talk today, hopefully I convince you that my 3 projects were able to address some of the questions related to the OH, but it definitely opens more questions that related to the OH chemistries as well, and that's also not the full picture yet. And this schematic, I'm also presenting further more questions also related to the OH that addressing the atmospheric chemistry and climate feedback. For example, in this talk today, our main motivation of studying OH chemistry is related to this methane budget. However, OH also has a very tight linkage to the ozone, to the tropospheric ozone, which is also considered as a very important greenhouse gases in the climate systems. In addition to that, we have this BVOC emission interference that give us the connections to the biogeochemistry. We also have this biogenic emission, these biomass burning emissions, as well as the anthropogenic emissions that are linked to the human activities, as well as the air quality management. So overall, if we really want to further address on these OH chemistry related to chemistry climate feedbacks, I will argue that more observations is definitely required, both for the OH direct observations and the OH chemical drivers, as well as meteorology drivers. But also we will aim to build more new model frameworks such as Aqua-chem, as well as new statistical analysis tools such as machine learning model. And all these new tools together can help us address these questions. And I will end here and happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Qindan. We have 10 minutes for questions. I'll start with the question. You talk about one of the motivation to study OH is its influence on methane budget. So if you run the idealized experiment that increase OH by 5%, this is the magnitude you show for the 2-degree warming project. Like how big differences are we talking about for methane? Concentration potential.
So the 3% increase in the OH will lead to like 6% increase in the methane chemical loss. That will lead to about 3% changes in the OH concentrations in the atmosphere. So it's a scale of the methane changes that's very similar to the real world methane budget changes that we are observing nowadays.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you for your talk. Very great work here. I'm curious about your climate and chemistry model. Is that based on existing structure of some existing models, or you just design a new structure? Could you explain more about how you build that?
Yes, so I'm using 3 different models here. The first two CSM2 vacancies and the CAM-Chem model are built by NCAR, so it's an existing model framework. And Aqua-chem is fully developed in our group by myself, and this is the main model framework is inherited from the CAM-Chem framework, but we changed the source code to add in the aquaplanet capacity that can be run along with the climate modules. So the CAM-2 model community has a very good organization that they were able to put all the model framework into the same modules, and you can just turn on and off one individual model to realize the different modeling needs. But in the current CSM model communities, we have the Aquaplanet model. Aquaplanet that's only for that's idealized model for the climate modeling framework. So it's not coupled with the chemistry. So what we did is just to change the source code and make the Aquaplanet configuration that can be coupled with the chemistry to realize the Aqua-chem complexity. Yes.
Thanks for your nice talk. My question is, what will be the pathways that ENSO influence the source and the sink of OH according to your knowledge?
Yes, so different emission drivers will have different stories. So for the lighting NOx emission, the most widely used parameterization of lighting NOx emission is parameterized based on the cloud top height. So when you have the warmer temperature, you will expect the more larger deep convections going on, and the deep convection will lead to a larger lightning activities. So that's lighting NOx emission. For the biogenic emissions, normally we will expect that the warmer temperature during El Niño will increase the soil moisture and the soil temperature in the biogenic systems, and that will lead to a higher isoprene and monoturbine emissions. For the biomass burning emissions, this is more complicated, and there have been studies arguing that it's mainly driven also by the soil moisture, but there are also some studies suggesting that the precipitation might be the driver between that link to the connection between OH and biomass burning emissions. So what I'm showing here is only the instantaneous response of the biomass burning emission to the ENSO. So you will only see the signal during the maritime continent. But in fact, there's also, for example, the Amazon forest, that the biomass burning, the fire activities in the Amazon forest is also linked to the ENSO, but there is a 1-year lag because of the precipitation drivers, and this is not reflected in the OH studies that I show here.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you for a great talk. So I'm very curious when you say that it has some tree, and so we went to the chemistry variables. Did you see, following research about different space-time or different regional, and so like EP, CP, and W? So, thank you.
Yes, so we definitely think that this asymmetry is the dominant driver would be the nonlinear response of the chemistry itself, but these regional ENSO patterns will also play a role. But we didn't specifically diagnose the impact of the regional ENSO patterns, but it's to some extent embedded in the composite SSE patterns that we built.
I have a slightly more technical question to follow up. So in the second project, like when you do the sensitivity simulation for the ENSO drivers, like how exactly did you prescribe the emissions? Like, are you taking historical biomass burning emissions for the ENSO years, or like how did you do that?
Yes, so for the lightning and VOC emissions, we just use the interactive scheme. So once we have the interactive schemes, it will automatically respond to the meteorology changes under the ENSO phases. But the biomass burning, we do it in a different way. So what we did is getting the GFDL emission inventory for the past like 20 to 30 years, and then we align it with the real world ENSO Niño 3-4-point index, and then do the composite biomass burning emissions using the observed ENSO phases. And then once we have these compensated biomass burning emission built up for different ENSO phases, we put them into the model as the input.
Like meaning that you have a separate statistical relationship between the ENSO index and the GSAT dimension.
Yes. So that's a good point. So the composite biomass burning emissions is actually aligned with the real world and ENSO phases. So it's not perfectly matching to the modeled ENSO phases, and that will lead to some of the impact into the results.
Any other questions? Let me check the Zoom. Yeah, Guan Yu had a question. In your simulations, have you considered the impact of aerosol on OH?
Not really. So the aerosols, we do have the interactive aerosol schemes turned on, but we are not enacting any specific changes in the aerosol emissions and then show the impact onto the OH. I tend to, for my OH work, I tend to stay away from the aerosol a little bit because first of all, the trace gas chemistry is complicated enough, and it has it's the largest lever onto the OH chemistry. And aerosol might play a role, but the role is much minor. And second is the aerosol scheme is very complex in the model schemes, and it's very hard to specifically diagnose the aerosol changes in addition to the trace gas changes because the aerosol scheme is coupled with each other. But yeah, that's an interesting open question. Yeah.
Just along the aerosol, right? Aerosol impact radiation. Does that counted in your simulations?
Yes, so in our photolysis calculation, we do have the prescribed aerosols into the code. So to some extent, it counts for the impact of the aerosols, but it's prescribed, so it's not interactive. So when the model simulates the different aerosols, it's not encoupled into the photolysis scheme to further impact the radiation. Yeah, that would be an interesting question, and to make it fully coupled and to see how the aerosol impacts through the radiation will impact the OH chemistry.
Is that another question or? Okay. All right, well, thank you, everybody. We'll now go to Swansea room for lunch, and you will have opportunity to talk to speakers in front.